Good afternoon, everyone. This is Laura Cozzi from the International Energy Agency. I'm co-leading the World Energy Outlook and have the pleasure to chair today a deep dive into our renewables focus of this year World Energy Outlook. You will be hearing the presentation of the 3 chapters of the WEO that were devoted to renewables this year from the key lead authors Marco Baroni, Brent Warner, Stephanie Bouquet. For those of you that are able to follow us online today, this is great. For those of you who cannot and have to interrupt, please be aware that we will be posting on our website a recording of today's event. Let us start immediately into the content of the presentation. This is the first time that the agency as a whole has put so much resources into renewable energy with the special focus in the World Energy Outlook, the medium-term renewable market report, and several other reports devoted on renewables. Let's look at the picture of today for renewables. 2015 was in many years a record year for renewables. One notable thing to remember and note is the following. For the first time ever, power sector capacity installation of renewables were larger than that of coal, gas, oil, and nuclear combined, so that in 2015, for the first time globally, we have more renewable capacity installed in the power sector than coal. China has been leading the deployment of renewables in the power sector and has continued to be doing so in 2015. It has also been leading the deployment of renewables, especially for solar water heaters, but has been slowing down. Our latest estimate for renewable subsidies in 2015 totaled 150 billion globally. The important thing to note about this number is that the large majority of it was for policies to support power sector deployment of renewables. Over 80% of the subsidies are going to power. If you look at transport, this is less than 20%, and the heat sector was only absorbing less than 1% of this amount. This largely reflects an imbalance in government policies towards supporting deployment of renewables in the power sector vis-à-vis heat and transport, and we'll come back to that with some detail later on. For what concerns the transport sector, we are seeing the penetration of renewables happening in 2 different ways. First of all, mostly devoted in the road transport sector. One way is biofuels in cars, and that's been increasing even in 2015. Another way now is through electrification. We have seen for the first time in 2015 the number of cars on road fully electric or powered by electricity reaching 1.3 million. The flip side of the story is that only a small portion of these 1.3 million vehicles were fully powered by electricity, and this number is less than 20%. You all are aware that on the 4th of November, the Paris Agreement came into force. Of this Paris Agreement, 190 countries put forward what we call INDCs, or pledges. Of these pledges, the energy sector constituted the very core of many of them, and renewables, together with energy efficiency, really were at the heart of the pledges that countries put forward to meet their greenhouse gas emission reductions. We shouldn't forget, however, in this picture of today, that we still have 1.2 billion people still not having access to electricity. Now, this is the picture of today. How this picture will evolve in a movie over the next 25 years will depend on 2 things. The movie director, which in this case is really governments, and what script they want to follow, meaning which policies they intend to implement. What we're going to do here now is to show you in parallel 2 different movies. One that you may want to call the movie of the Paris Pledge. So governments will pursue what they've pledged in their Paris Agreement in the Paris Pledges. And the second movie that we will run in parallel is the 2-degree movie, in which governments would need to intensify significantly their efforts to decarbonize. So let's look at this first movie in which governments will stick to what they've promised in their 190 pledges. How will the energy sector change going forward? First, we see a very significant difference compared to the past, and it is the following. We are expecting a rate of economic growth of around 3.5% going forward, very similar to what we've seen over the past 25 years, but the incremental demand that will be needed to fuel this economic growth is going to be much less. In the past, we needed 60% of demand increase to fuel 3.5% economic growth. In the future, this rate is reduced by half, is only 30%. Why is this happening? Simply because energy efficiency is becoming cheaper and much more widespread. How are we going to, which fuels are they going to fuel this incremental demand growth? There was a very clear king in the past. It was King Coal. It has fueled global economic development over the past 2.5 decades. Coal is king no more. It's only relegated to fuel part of a small incremental demand. Similar story goes for oil, with countries having seen a peak and in continuous decline, and other sectors concentrating more and more demand growth being freight, aviation, and petrochemicals. Natural gas is the element of continuity between the past and the future, but the big growth story is low carbon technologies. Low carbon technologies are the new king, are the king of the next 25 years under the Paris Pledges movie. Part of the low carbon technology story is nuclear, mostly concentrated in China, but the large majority of this growth is going to be renewables. The interesting thing on renewables, we'll see many of those, but the first that I want to highlight here is the following. This story is not a story of a bunch of countries, of a limited number of countries. This is a global story. This race to low carbon and renewable technologies is a race of every country. China, for the sheer size, is getting over 20% of the incremental demand growth, but I draw your attention to the fact that the second largest growth is coming from Africa, where 1 billion people are expected to get access to electricity over the next 25 years, and they will be using a large variety of renewable sources, ranging from hydro to solar to geothermal. Now, if you look at the emissions profile that this type of Paris pledges, so what the 190 countries have pledged and would follow, the story is the following. Energy-related CO2 emissions would slow down compared to the past, but they would still continue to increase, and the long-term temperature increase by 2100 is not compatible to a 2-degree trajectory. We would expect something along 2.7 degrees. So countries would need to do much more. We would need to see a peak and a decline in CO2 emissions. Just let me give you one number about renewables. In the Paris Pledge movie, renewables would account for around 40% of renewables generation by 2040. This would need to be ramped up to 60% if we were in a 2-degree scenario. Now, I will move to Brent Warner to go into a deep dive of what we're expecting for the power sector. Brent.
Thank you, Lara. I'd just like to briefly discuss the role of renewable energy in the power sector in these two parallel movies. Energy accounts for 2/3 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions today, and the power sector is the biggest contributor to global CO2 emissions. So obviously, any strategy to fight climate change must look to reduce CO2 emissions from power, and therefore increasingly rely on renewables and other low-carbon technologies. Now, if we look back over the past several decades, coal has accounted for about 40% of total electricity generation, something that must change going forward in order to stay on track for 2 degrees Celsius. The low carbon share over the period increased with the expansion of nuclear power in the 1970s and 80s, But in more recent years, renewables beyond hydropower, namely wind power and solar PV, as well as bioenergy, have increased rapidly. If we look forward over the next 25 years, in the movie along lines of the Paris Pledges, we see that under these current and proposed policies, we see coal's share declining, though continued use is seen in many developing countries. Nuclear and hydropower's contribution remain stable, with other renewables, mainly wind and solar PV, providing the majority of the growth going forward, raising the low carbon share of total electricity generation to around 50% by 2040. However, as we've seen, that this will not keep us on pace to meet the 2-degree target. So overall, we'll need to see the unabated coal share head towards zero. And to compensate for that, the low carbon share move beyond 80%, with renewables leading the way, and particularly again with solar PV and wind in the lead. So what does this mean for solar PV and wind in terms of generation? Let's take a closer look. So this transformation has already begun, as we've seen in these last few years, and it's been started and sustained in large part by government policies, supporting the deployment of wind and solar PV, along with other renewable energy technologies. Now, these policies have created a positive feedback loop, where new policies allow for accelerated deployment, and this greater deployment means economies of scale and learning by doing, driving down the technology costs. This is how we've gotten 40 to 75% reductions in the cost of solar PV since 2010. And additionally, a 1/3 reduction in the cost of wind power over the last 6 or 7 years. So in turn, these lower costs also help to support and strengthen future policy decisions, also triggering more widespread use and interest in renewables going forward. We now stand at over 150 countries having policies that support renewables in the power sector. And eventually, as the costs keep coming down, we see that a larger and larger share of new renewables will require no subsidies at all. So if we look at last year's outlook, our assessment was that the policy frameworks were already sufficient to provide a 10-fold increase in solar PV generation through to 2040, and a 5-fold increase in wind power to 2040. But since then, we've seen additional measures and targets being adopted, and in particular in 2 of the largest markets, China and the United States. Considerations of China's 13th 5-year plan and extensions of key tax credits in the United States have led us to increase our projections through 2040. For solar PV, we see that this has increased the outlook by about 40%, mainly coming from China and the United States, but also we're seeing this proliferation in other regions and other countries. So more countries are on board and moving towards supporting solar PV and growth in the future. China also makes up the bulk of the increase in wind power, which is about 10% higher than we saw last year, which this is all very good news. And as Laura mentioned, this brings us up to 37%, close to 40% of total generation in the power sector in 2040. But again, we know that this is not enough. In order to move towards a path in line with 2 degrees Celsius, wind and PV need to increase by at least 50% more. And this is alongside expansion of other renewable technologies and other low carbon technologies. But really we're seeing that wind and PV would produce the largest share of this increase and would be really critical. So I mentioned this feedback loop. So what would this mean for the costs and the competitiveness of renewables versus fossil fuels? Something we hear in the news and discussed quite often. So if we look at 4 key regions, which today account for the vast majority of wind and solar PV, and will account for more than 3/4 of the total wind and solar PV market through 2040. We have a picture here of the fossil fuel side in terms of levelized cost of electricity. And if we go ahead and click there, we have the cost of wind and solar PV coming in, and the levelized cost, which has been coming down rapidly, and this is for projects that have been completed or completed in 2015. And we're seeing these costs decline all the time and coming down even more. So over time, going forward, we see the balance shifting strongly towards renewables. While the levelized cost of solar PV is coming down by about half, and wind power additionally, we see that fossil fuel plants become more expensive due to rising fossil fuel prices, as well as the introduction and strengthening of CO2 prices in several key markets. For example, CO2 prices in the United States, European Union, and China help give the competitive edge to renewables through 2040. But of course, these dynamics mean that renewables achieve cost parity with fossil fuels in many regions over the next decade. Now I've shown a picture of the cost, but of course, for a full comparison, we need to also consider the value side. We developed this year for the special focus on renewables a new detailed model of the hourly balance of supply and demand in the power sector, which enabled us to look at the concept of value for renewables and for all technologies. And this also enabled us to look at the integration of variable renewables in the power system, which my colleague Marco will discuss shortly. So the final point, if we put these two pieces together of cost and value, we see that the share of new wind and solar PV electricity that is fully competitive, that's profitable based on market revenues alone, that exceeds 50% of new wind and solar PV by 2030 and 2/3 by 2040. This is very good news and demonstrates this feedback loop that additional policy support leads to further costs, which accelerates the growth and outlook for renewables, particularly wind and solar PV. So with that, thank you, and I'll hand the floor to Marco.
Many thanks, Brent. Brent mentioned the strong growth of PV and wind and the development of a new hourly model. The hourly model has been developed for several reasons to analyze several aspects. On one side, surely the value of the electricity generation, as Brent mentioned, but also, on the other side, to provide useful insights for the entire power system when we increase the share of generation of wind energy. The power systems require a continuous balance of demand and supply at all times. And we therefore looked at the evolution of electricity demand hour by hour for all sectors and uses to be able to look at how the evolution of light and heavy industries, agriculture and service sectors, the residential sector by all its uses from lighting to electricity demand for water heating, to air conditioning, how all of these uses evolve over time, how the increasing electrification in these final uses affect the shape of demand, and in particular, for example, with the expansion of electric vehicles in transport. This evolution has particular importance because of its implication on the analysis of demand-side response that we will come back onto in some of the next slides. This evolution of the hourly demand, so this close look, allows us to see how demand can be met by the evolving power generation and what role wind and solar can play in this. So this is particularly important because wind and solar PV have inherent characteristics and that are mainly linked to the fact that their production is weather dependent. In absence of integration measures, therefore, the challenges to match demand and supply can lead to production of excess demand, as shown in the graph, and requiring, therefore, to curtail electricity to curtail production. The hourly model computes all of this on an hourly basis, day by day, for all days in the year, and allows us to assess when curtailment happens, for how long, and in what amount. So if we look at this challenge and we take the example, we aggregate curtailment on an annual basis, and we examine two cases, Europe and India, we can see how at growing shares of wind on the horizontal axis and solar on the vertical axis, we find that in the absence of integration measures, significant amount of curtailment start to occur when variable renewables, PV and wind, go beyond, well, start approaching a share of 30% in the mix, with increasing volumes and number of hours in the year when excessive generation happens. In the European Union, as it's shown, this can reach up to the equivalent of 4 months in the year. When the number of well, why are the number of hours of curtailment and the amount of curtailment important? Well, the number of hours of excessive generation are important as the resulting prices in those hours would be resulting to zero or near zero. And this would have or has important consequences for the revenues of the plants that are generating in those hours, and in particular wind and PV themselves. The amount of excessive generation, on the other side, is very important because this generation is effectively not useful, is wasted, if we want to say so, and cannot contribute to the decarbonization of the system, and worsens, of course, the economics of these plants. So we have analyzed how what are the implications of integration measures, and in particular of demand-side response and of storage, and we saw how these can be really critical, going beyond this 30% threshold, and can reduce significantly both the amount of hours of curtailment and the volume. Volume reaching less than 2% in both the European Union and in India when these measures are implemented. Of course, for this to happen, new changes in the market structure are required in a number of countries to be able, in particular, for storage and demand-side response to to access the market and to be deployed in large amounts. Now, as demand-side response plays such an important role in reaching high shares of wind and PV generation, I will now pass the floor to my colleague Stephanie to tell us something more about it.
Thanks, Marco. In fact, indeed, demand-side response is really key to integrate more solar PV and wind in the power generation mix. We have assessed how the load curve could be reshaped through demand-side response measures. We have really evaluated how much of the load at each hour could be shifted to another hour or could be shed in order really to reshape the electricity demand pattern. The potential of demand-side response varies, of course, by region, by sector, and by end users. So today, even if demand-side response programs are directed mainly in the industry sector, we have assessed that in all regions, most of the current potential at lower cost lies in fact in the buildings sector, especially for heating and cooling. because we can take advantage of the thermal inertia of the buildings and of the appliances. So we have assessed that currently the technical potential of demand-side response is around 15 to 20% of the overall electricity demand. So that means that if for each hour of the 8,760 hours of the year, if we sum the amount of load that could be shifted, this will represent up to 20% of the annual load. Of course, this potential takes also into account behavior limits. So, for example, we won't force children to use their PlayStation at 3 in the morning to increase variable renewable share in the power generation mix. But by 2040, into our 2-degree scenario, the increased penetration of electric vehicles will also push us the overall potential of demand-side response. So this will enable to maintain the overall potential in the European Union and in the United States at around 20%. The outlook for India is also totally different because in this country we expect to have electricity demand to almost triple by 2040, and the rapid growth of buildings electricity demand will also lead to higher potential for demand-side response. Nevertheless, we have to keep in mind that when we see this global potential, this doesn't represent the various situations that we can face every day of the year. Of course, when we have 20% of demand-side response potential, this doesn't mean that at each hour 20% of the load can be shifted to another hour of the year. So to come up with this potential of demand-side response, we had first assessed how the load curve will evolve for 36 typical days, so the 12 months of the year, 3 different days of the week, so weekday, Saturday, and Sunday, for each sector and each end user, as Marco just said. So we include the cement sector in the industry sector, or the use of televisions and electric boilers in buildings. So for each end user, we have assessed how much of the load could be shifted to another hour. So for example, if we take India by 2040, we have assessed that during winter months, only a small share of electricity demand could be shifted or shed to another period of the day. The range for each hour on the graph shows the maximum share of the load for the various days of these 3 months, so from December to February. But the situation can be completely different when we look at summer months, where air conditioning in those months plays an important role of overall electricity demand in India. So the share of load that could be shifted during those months is up to a third of overall electricity demand in India in those months. So shifting load towards periods of high generation from solar PV and wind is really critical for demand-side response. Otherwise, as Marco just explained, curtailment might be required. But nevertheless, issues and solutions are not always occurring at the same time. So on the scale below of these figures, we have now the share of solar PV and wind in the power generation mix. So when you have green color, it means that the share is really low. When you have red, that means that the share of solar PV and wind is really high and that you will need the help of demand-side response. Thus, to avoid curtailment, you will need to transfer some loads of the green hours, so really the night in winter, to red hours, so during midday when solar PV is really important in the power generation mix in India. Unfortunately, as you can see, that is not the moment where the potential for demand-side response is the highest. Thus, this is really to highlight the fact that demand-side response is really key to lower curtailment, but this is not the only solution that needs to be put in place to solve the whole integration issue. So until now in our presentation, most of our presentation has focused on the power sector. But this doesn't mean that this is the only sector that is concerned by renewables. There are other stories that are often overlooked and which need to be told. So in practice, the energy service that consumers demand more than any other is heat. For industrial production, so through industry process, and also to heat our homes for space heating and water heating. And in fact, today, renewable heat is actually produced on a similar scale as the power sector. A large part of this renewable is in fact biomass for industry and heat in residential, but also another big component is solar water heaters. In fact, a lot of people know about solar PV, but not many people know that the energy delivered by solar water heaters last year, so in 2015, was nearly twice the level of solar PV. The other main energy service provided by renewable today is also transport, so in the form of biofuels. But how does this will evolve by 2040 for those three sectors? So in our central scenario, we see renewable contribution growing for all the sectors, but the most rapid progress by far is in electricity. And even if the outlook for renewables for all the sectors is positive, this is still not enough, because by 2040, the share of renewables in total electricity demand, as Laura and Brent already mentioned, is around 40%, but this share is around only 10% for heat and transport. But this is not really surprising, because as Brent mentioned, you have already 150 countries that have policies that focus on renewables for power, but only half of them have policies in place that promote renewables for heat and transport. But the question is now, how can renewables break into those two areas, in those two sectors, heat and transport? In fact, there are two options to promote renewables in those two sectors, either directly with the use of solar, bioenergy, or biofuels for transport, or via the indirect route, so to use renewable-based electricity. So if we look now at what could happen into our central scenario by 2040, we see that bioenergy will make most of the growth of heat demand in the industry sector in terms of renewable, because the higher temperature levels of heat needed in some industrial process favor the use of bioenergy to meet this growing heat demand. In the transport sector, biofuels play a large role to meet the growing demand for mobility. In buildings, this is slightly different, because solar is going to play an important role in terms of renewables, because some countries have already implemented mandatory policies that are part of their buildings energy codes to include renewables and to promote renewables for water heating purposes into new buildings. But we don't need to forget the indirect route. That is also an important option, and that could be a way to provide renewable-based electricity, for example, to heat pumps for buildings and industry, or electric cars for transport. Nevertheless, for this indirect route, we need to think about integrated policies, because it does not make any sense from an environmental and climate perspective to promote electric vehicles and then charge them with power from coal-fired power plants. In parallel of this increase of renewables, we expect also a decrease of fossil fuel use in buildings, but we expect that in industry and transport, fossil fuels will still meet the majority of the growth by 2040. However, in our 2-degree scenario, the situation is completely different. The increase of renewable is expected to be bigger in all sectors, and for heat purposes in buildings and industry, we expect to see a decrease of fossil fuel uses, while for transport, the growth of fossil fuel will be only around a quarter of the growth of renewables. This really highlights the fact that there is no one-size-fits solutions for decarbonization of buildings, industry, and transport sector. The increased use of renewables needs to go hand in hand with electrification and energy efficiency. Energy efficiency enables to lower heat demand, for example, through insulation in buildings, or to lower fuel consumption of road transport, while electrification enables to reduce the use of fossil fuels where renewables cannot be used. So I will now give back the floor to Laura that will give some concluding points.
So thank you very much, Stephanie. So we have done the tour of renewable use in different sectors. We've looked at power, we have looked at heat, we have looked at transport. Now we take a step back and we ask ourselves, where does it leave us in terms of implications for energy sector investments? In 2015, we have invested around $1.8 billion in energy sector. Most of it still going through fossil fuels, despite having seen a very sharp decline in investment directed in the oil and gas upstream sector due to the very low oil prices, and having seen robust continued investment in renewables, mostly for power. In the scenario that is compatible with the Paris pledges, what and where would investment need to go? So the first message is that in this scenario, which is in this chart shown as central scenario, you would need to see a small increase in annual average investment, not huge, and the share wouldn't be significantly different to what we have seen in 2000, basically over the past 5 years. In a way, the commitment government made with the Paris pledges is basically a continuation of the type of investment trends we have seen over the past 5 years in the energy sector. However, in a scenario compatible with a 2-degree trajectory, first of all, we wouldn't need to spend much more, in fact, a little bit less, and this is the first very important message to bring to policymakers and industries alike. But the share of this investment would need to change very significantly with those of fossil fuels shrinking from around 70% today to around 43%, and that of renewables to more than double compared to what we have been seeing over the past few years. In a way, the big push that we are seeing in renewables, in the way that the governments have committed in Paris, will produce more electricity and heat from renewables, but very much for the reason that those investments are becoming more efficient as the technologies are becoming more efficient. A real increase in the amount of value in investment would only occur in a 2-degree scenario with an increase on the amount of the absolute volume going into renewables vis-a-vis other sources. So, to very quickly conclude, we do believe that the Paris Agreement was a big milestone, but it's only a framework insofar as is really in the hands of policymakers to make sure that those goals are translated into real government policy actions, as there exists still a gap between the Paris pledges and the ultimate 2-degree goal. We think that energy security is remaining a concern. However, this is shifting. It is shifting towards the electricity sector that so far wasn't really one that was under the spotlight, but it will increasingly become a sector that we need to look into. While on the more traditional energy security concerns on oil and gas imports, policymakers have in their hands a largest variety of tools to deal with them, most notably renewables and energy efficiency that have become much cheaper and will become even cheaper going forward. The very good news is that wind and solar PV are increasingly competitive, but we see that there is a need for continuous support in the years to come, especially as fossil fuel prices continue to remain slightly depressed, making it harder for those technologies to compete on a purely financial basis in the absence of any other support. Achieving climate goals will hinge very significantly on our ability to step up more the deployment of renewable technologies in power, in heat, and in transport. And integration measures will be key. They will be key in the power sector to make sure that variable renewables are integrated into the system in the best possible way, that integration across sectors occurs in a higher and more coordinated manner, and that electricity market reforms are done to make sure that those market changes are at low impact for all actors involved. And finally, to conclude on what Stephanie has elaborated on, for us, in a way, the chapter of renewable competitiveness in the power sector has been won. We need to turn our attention into heat and transport to make sure that the similar ramp-up in renewables that we have seen and we will be seeing in electricity will also be repeated in those two sectors. So with this, we conclude the presentation, and I would like to thank very much the hundreds of people that have been following us and sending us throughout these 45 minutes questions, compliments. So really a big thank from all of us here. What I would like to do now is to take on some of the questions that you have been sending and coordinating with my colleagues. I would like to start with the question from Jonathan Strauch that asked, why did you get your renewables forecast wrong, and how can you explain that you will be getting them right this time? I would like to ask Brent to take these questions and elaborate.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the easy question. One that we get often and is really a critical point of understanding of what the World Energy Outlook is. In the World Energy Outlook, we present long-term scenarios based on identified drivers. This is largely policy drivers, but also technology changes, technology evolution that's been ongoing, and how we see that rolling forward. And so these policies and identified drivers provide the descriptions of these scenarios and pathways going forward. And as you can see, in the World Energy Outlook, we present multiple pathways. Today, we've presented two parallel stories, showing one following along the Paris pledges and another following the overall achievement of the 2-degree Celsius goal. What the WEO does not provide are predictions or forecasts of for any technologies. This would imply that we would need to make decisions about many developments outside of the energy sector, in addition to energy sector policies and technologies that we're not in the business of making, and any long-term predictions and long-term forecasts are really fraught with difficulty, but this is not what the World Energy Outlook is. So in fact, these scenarios are meant to provide an assessment of where we're headed under the current and emerging policy landscape and where we need to go to meet these international climate goals. And that's one element of what we do, but these scenarios provide a context for us to do that. So in fact, through the years, the projections for renewables have increased in line with increasing policy support. We're now over 150 countries that support renewables and power, as I mentioned, and this is a much larger number than if you went back 10 years ago. And that's a great thing, and we applaud these advances and steps to close the gap towards reaching 2 degrees.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brent. We have a couple of questions that were actually asking around flexibility options and the way we have treated them. I'm referring in particular to questions asked by Carsten Capion and Andrew Pedler, and they were around what's the situation of storage today, and do you envisage a scenario in which storage needs will expand significantly? What do you think about battery technology? And finally, one about did you consider high capacity factors wind, and how could they help with curtailment? Marco, would you like to take these on?
With pleasure. Thanks for the questions. They all related to the integration of variable renewables, of wind and solar PV into the power system. Of course, when we're talking about integration, I mentioned the specific analysis about demand response and batteries. So we'll come back on the battery question soon. But before getting there, I would say that the higher capacity factors technologies, so the evolution of the wind and solar technologies, as well as all the other technologies, is integrated into the WIA projections and constitutes effectively one of the integration measures. Of course, we have the development of the grids, the possibility of smoothing profiles of PV and wind through additional interconnections, but also new technologies. So the question about the higher capacity factor fits very well in here, as for example the large rotors turbines do provide a smooth, a higher capacity factor, but also a smoother profile that can often be better integrated in the system, and therefore, as all the other integration measures do reduce the curtailment, the need for curtailment. The analysis that we presented today was focused on demand side response and batteries, hence the answer on batteries. So when reaching high levels of variable renewables, we face the issue of excessive generation, of generation exceeding demand in several hours, and this can be reduced either moving demand in those moments or storing the energy to be able to use it in a different way, which is exactly what storage does. So storage is an integral part of our projections. The installed capacity of storage in the electricity sector today is about 150 gigawatts. This in our 2-degree scenario reaches almost 400, with a variety of technologies, but battery technology being one of the essential ones that is going to be deployed is set to be deployed in the future, not only in the power sector, but of course, for example, for electric vehicles.
Thank you very much, Marco. I will move along with another question on demand-side responses that Urs Ruth sent over, and I will address it to Stephanie. What concepts do you think will support the wider deployment of demand-side responses in the building sector, and what's the situation today, Stephanie?
Thanks for the question. So it's true that to reach the full potential required of demand-side responses required coordinated policy measures and also the diffusion of some technologies which are smart meters and also remote control load device. So why smart meters? Of course, to have a better accuracy of the electricity consumption, and also remote control load device to make sure that we can act on the load. But to have residential consumers and services sectors consumers to participate to demand-side response programs, you need also to have time-dependent price signals, so the use of, for example, time-of-use tariffs or real-time pricing, but this is more likely for industrial partners. But of course, residential sector is really kind of decentralized customers, so you need also an additional actor in the market to make sure that those consumers can participate to demand-side response, which is the aggregator. So this is something that is already happening only in a few countries, but the aggregator could aggregate the various loads of the various actors in the building sector to make sure that they could participate as one actor in the electricity market to demand-side response as a virtual power plant that is already happening, for example, in California.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So we've got another couple of questions from Stefan Singer and Andres Fernandez that were asking us clarification about what our 2-degree scenario is. Is it a 50% probability or higher? and what is the IEA position vis-a-vis phasing out coal. So to clarify, our 450 scenario is indeed the 50% probability scenario to remain by 2100 below 2 degrees. For the first time this year in the World Energy Outlook, we have been looking at more stringent decarbonization scenario, notably what we call a well below 2 degrees scenario, which is equivalent to a higher probability of staying below 2 degrees, 66% probability. And we also had a first look at a 1.5 degree scenario. To give an idea of the different type of challenge that the energy sector would be facing in this type of scenarios, in the 450 scenario, we would need to see a peak in energy-related CO2 emissions within the next 5 years, and the energy sector would need to be fully decarbonized by the end of this century. Fully decarbonized, what does it mean? It means that the electricity sector would need to completely be decarbonized, but also the building sector would need to be completely decarbonized, the industry sector would need to be completely decarbonized, the transport sector would need to be completely decarbonized. This is in a scenario, the 450 scenario that we have gone through. If you go to a 1.5 degree scenario, the date of net zero emissions for the energy sector would be moved forward to 2040. So it means that we would have another 25 years to be able to fully decarbonize each of those sectors. In the scenario that takes a higher probability of staying below 2, this year would be around 2060. Clearly, the role of coal changes very significantly according to the stringency of the probability that you take and the level of ambitions of the scenario. The more stringent the scenario is, the lower the role for coal, and vice versa. The higher the availability of CCS at low costs, the larger the scope of coal to remain somewhat as a transition in those scenarios. In the meantime, we have also got the questions about nuclear that I would like to address to Marco. Is Bruno Marce that is asking, your nuclear projection seems to be quite optimistic. Why do you think this would happen if renewables costs are coming down so steeply, and where would you see that happen?
Thank you for the question. We indeed have an increase of nuclear capacity in our central scenario that goes from about 400 gigawatts today to about 600 by 2040. Now, of these 200 gigawatts of capacity increase, of course, a large part is concentrated in a quite limited number of countries. So the situation today is of about 65 gigawatts under construction, plus 10 that came online already this year, which means about 75 of those 200. So more than a third of that is already under construction. And we see the deployment of nuclear continuing, in particular in the countries that have a strong policy push towards this. And I would surely name China, that accounts for more than half of this increase to 2040, but also Russia, Korea, India, and several others. Of course, the future of nuclear depends very much in a number of countries about its cost on one side, the policy push on the other, but also on the public acceptance in the different countries and how the concerns of the population is going to be addressed through the different policies.
Thank you very much, Marco. I will take the last question and then we will need to conclude. I will address the last question to Brent and then give information to the many others that have sent questions how we will deal with those questions. So the last one that we are taking on today is from Masaki Horie, and is asking, what is the role of oil and gas prices in your projections? How do they impact them?
Thanks very much for the question. Oil and gas prices are clearly play a central role in the overall projections in many different ways throughout the energy sector. So I'll confine my comments to how it affects the renewables, the outlook for renewables here. So you can imagine that this affects the outlook in several different ways. If we take these one at a time, oil and gas. The oil price projections have in terms of renewables, oil is being largely used in transport, and in terms of renewables, the competition there is with biofuels, and so this higher oil prices improve the competitive outlook for biofuels. But this has two effects. One, that it reduces the cost of subsidies for biofuels to achieve policy goals, as well as enhances the market forces for biofuels to go beyond policy goals, tapping into competitive forces where this is inexpensive. For gas, this is largely in power, is the main competition. So you have competition with renewables directly, as I showed in the slides earlier, which is this competition for new investment. But it also reflects the value, or changes the value for renewables. So it's this assessment of value that I discussed that affects the competitiveness of renewables and their ability to stand on their own. So again, they can contribute to the assessment of renewable subsidies to achieve policy goals, as well as providing the market forces for renewables to go beyond that and to, as we mentioned, this gaining momentum. Ultimately, there's also competition within fossil fuels, and this has power mix effects as well. Thank you.
So many thanks, Brent. This webinar is coming to a conclusion. Just three information. There are many questions that came on through while we were doing the webinar. Several of them we were not able to answer. We will get back to you via email. Many of you asked about the presentation. We will be happily share the presentation with all of you. In case you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to send it to us directly at wio.iea.org. Thanks for your interest and your patience today, and many thanks to Brent Warner, Marco Baroni, and Stephanie Bouquet for this insightful presentation. Thank you very much.